Minnesota's Iron Range, 1904. While every homesteader raced to throw up the tightest, most timber-efficient roof before winter, Finnish bachelor Eli Virtanen was still cutting rafters in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful lumber. They called his roof a mushroom cap. He built eaves that extended 4 feet beyond his cabin walls, twice as wide as anyone thought necessary. The local sawmill tallyman warned younger settlers not to copy such timber waste if they wanted to stay solvent. Eli spent extra weeks on a roof others would have finished in days. Then the first real blizzard hit. Wind-driven snow piled 3 feet high against every tight eave cabin in the township. Neighbors were out at dawn with coal shovels, digging door-shaped holes into their own homes just to get outside. But Eli's place? He stepped out like a man leaving a barn, not a bunker. His door wasn't buried. His windows weren't entombed. The snow line began exactly 4 feet away from his walls, like someone had drawn a boundary with a ruler. Standard cabins developed the familiar problem: snow packed against walls, doors frozen shut, sill logs soaking in meltwater. But that mushroom roof threw every flake out to the drip line, keeping Eli's cabin base dry and his access clear. What did this Finnish homesteader understand about water, snow, and structural survival that everyone else dismissed as immigrant foolishness? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The morning of November 15th, 1904, arrived with the kind of wind that turned snowflakes into horizontal needles. Across the Iron Range townships, men stepped outside to discover their doors had vanished behind white walls that rose past their waists. The blizzard had blown for 18 hours straight, depositing 3 feet of snow that packed hard against every cabin wall in the settlement. Henrik Koivisto grabbed his coal shovel and began the familiar winter ritual, carving a door-shaped tunnel through the drift that had sealed his family inside their own home. 2 cabins down, the Matela brothers were doing the same, cursing in Finnish as they dug toward daylight. The sawmill tallyman's place required a full hour of shoveling before his door would swing free. This was the price of tight eave construction in snow country. Every real storm turned your home into a tomb that demanded rescue from the outside. But at the Virtanen place, something different was happening. Eli stepped through his door like a man walking out of a barn on a calm spring morning. No shovel in his hands, no tunnel carved through packed snow. His door opened freely onto a swept-clean threshold, and his windows stood clear and unburied. The storm that had entombed his neighbors had somehow failed to touch his cabin walls. The difference was visible from 50 yards away. Every other cabin in the township sat buried to the eaves, with snow pressed tight against log walls and climbing toward the roof lines. Eli's cabin stood in the center of a perfect circle of clear ground. The snow line began exactly 4 feet from his walls and extended outward in all directions, as if someone had drawn a boundary with surveyor's precision. Where other cabins disappeared into white drifts, Eli's structure stood free and accessible. This was the mushroom roof in action, the same wide-brimmed construction that had drawn mockery all through the building season. Those 4-foot eaves that neighbors called wasteful timber were now proving their worth in the most practical terms possible. While tight eave roofs dumped their snow loads directly against cabin walls, Eli's extended overhang threw every flake outward to the drip line, creating what he called the dry perimeter. The physics were simple but devastating in their effectiveness. Snow sliding off a conventional roof fell within inches of the foundation, where it piled against doors, windows, and the critical junction where sill logs met stone piers. Wind then sculpted these piles into solid drifts that could climb halfway up a wall and freeze hard as concrete. But Eli's roof acted like a throwing arm, launching snow 4 feet away from the structure where wind could scatter it harmlessly across open ground. By mid-morning, the difference had become a public spectacle. Neighbors who had spent 2 hours digging themselves free began gathering in Eli's yard, staring at the clear ring around his cabin like witnesses to a magic trick. The same men who had called his roof a timber waste now stood silent, measuring the distance from his walls to the snow line with their eyes. 4 feet, exactly as designed. The sawmill tallyman arrived last, still brushing snow from his coat after the long dig-out from his own buried door. He walked the perimeter of Eli's cabin twice, studying the clean ground where his surveyor's mind expected to find drifts. The evidence was undeniable. While conventional wisdom had sealed every other cabin in the township, this odd Finnish roof had created a zone of perpetual access. Henrik Koivisto broke the silence first. "How many times you dig your door out this winter, Eli?" "Haven't yet," Eli replied, leaning against his dry door frame. "Don't expect I'll need to." The admission hit the gathered men like a physical blow. Every settler in snow country knew the mathematics of winter survival. Storms came in cycles, and each one demanded hours of shovel work to maintain access to your own home. Door digging was as inevitable as splitting firewood or banking coals, except apparently when your roof threw snow beyond the danger zone. The tallyman walked closer, examining the eave construction with professional interest. The rafters extended a full 48 inches beyond the cabin walls, supported by diagonal knee braces that angled down from the roof peak to the wall plates. Simple frontier carpentry, but scaled to dimensions that seemed excessive until you saw the results. Where his own tight eaves had created a snow trap, Eli's wide overhang had engineered a solution. "That's a lot of extra lumber," the tallyman said, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. "Less than I'd burn digging out every storm," Eli answered, "and my sill logs stay dry." The sill log comment drew nods from the older settlers. Everyone knew that wet wood was doomed wood in northern winters. Moisture at the foundation invited rot, insect damage, and structural failure that could condemn a cabin within a few seasons. Preservation wasn't just about comfort. It was about whether your investment in logs, chinking, and labor would survive long enough to matter. As the men dispersed back to their snow-buried cabins, the conversation had already shifted. Instead of mocking the mushroom roof, neighbors began asking practical questions. How long were those rafters? What angle for the braces? How far should the eaves extend? The storm had transformed Eli's construction choice from neighborhood joke to case study in engineering. The real test, however, was just beginning. November's blizzard was only the first in what would become a winter of legendary severity. The same season that buried supply trains and cut townships off from outside helped for months at a time. If the mushroom roof could handle one storm, the question remained whether it could survive the grinding series of freeze-thaw cycles, ice storms, and wind-driven snow that defined survival in the North Country. But for now, as Eli stepped back inside his accessible cabin while neighbors returned to their shovels, the advantage was clear. In snow country, the house that stayed reachable was the house that worked. The social pressure had begun in late August when Eli started cutting his rafters to unusual lengths. Every homesteader in the township understood the arithmetic of frontier construction. Winter didn't wait for perfection, and smart builders focused on speed over flourishes. A roof's job was to keep rain and snow from falling directly on your head, not to make architectural statements. The faster you enclosed your cabin, the sooner you could move on to the 100 other tasks that determined whether you'd survive until spring. But Eli worked differently. While neighbors raced to complete their roofs in 3 or 4 days, he spent 2 full weeks on his rafter system. The local men watched him measure and remeasure each timber, cutting lengths that extended far beyond what any reasonable roof required. When Henrik Koivisto asked why he needed such long rafters, Eli's answer made no sense to ears trained on efficiency. "Water ruins logs faster than cold," he said. "Gotta keep it away from the walls." The sawmill tallyman made his position clear during one of his regular rounds through the settlement. Standing in Eli's yard while examining the extended rafter tails, he shook his head with the authority of a man who had counted board feet for 15 years. "That roof's bigger than the house," he announced loud enough for nearby workers to hear. "You're building a timber circus, not a homestead." The comment drew laughter from men who measured wisdom in dollars saved and days shortened. Eli continued working without responding to the criticism. His building sequence followed principles learned from Finnish timber framers who had solved wet country problems for generations before Minnesota had county lines. First, He set his ridge beam high and cut his rafters to achieve a steep pitch, 12 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run. This aggressive slope would shed snow aggressively rather than collecting it in dangerous loads that could collapse the structure or create ice dams at the edges. The rafter tails presented the most challenging part of the construction. Extending rafters 48 inches beyond the wall plates required serious engineering to prevent sagging or failure under snow loads. Eli solved this with diagonal knee braces, 45-degree supports that transferred the overhang weight back into the main roof structure. Each brace was hand-hewn from local timber and connected to the wall plates with mortise and tenon joints that would hold under stress. The result looked excessive to neighbors accustomed to minimal overhangs, but the mathematics were sound. For the roof sheathing, Eli used tight-fitted boards with gaps minimized to prevent wind-driven snow from sifting through. He knew from old country experience that even small openings could allow enough moisture penetration to rot the rafter system from the inside. The roofing itself followed standard frontier practice. Cedar shakes split from local timber and overlapped to create multiple barriers against water penetration. Each course overlapped the one below by at least 4 inches, creating a shingled surface that would shed water quickly rather than allowing it to pool or penetrate. The positioning of the cabin itself reflected another layer of strategic thinking that neighbors initially dismissed as overthinking. Eli oriented his structure to place the door on the leeward side of the prevailing winter winds. This wasn't aesthetic preference, but survival engineering. Wind created snow drifts in predictable patterns, and placing a door where drifts naturally formed was asking for trouble. He also kept his woodpile 8 feet from the cabin walls, creating airflow that would prevent moisture from being trapped against the logs. The physics behind the wide eaves became clear as Eli explained his reasoning to curious visitors. Every roof shed water and snow, but the landing zone determined whether that shedding protected or damaged the structure. A tight eave dumped meltwater and snow within inches of the foundation, where it could splash back against the logs, soak into the chinking, and create the wet conditions where rot and insect damage thrived. The wide overhang moved this damage zone 4 feet away from the vulnerable walls. This moisture control principle wasn't Eli's invention. Norwegian stave churches had used similar wide eaves for centuries to protect their wooden structures from northern European weather. Finnish log builders routinely incorporated generous overhangs into barns and storage buildings, where moisture control determined whether grain and tools survived the season. Eli was simply applying old-world solutions to new-world problems, trusting techniques that had proved themselves over generations. The additional material costs were real but manageable. The extended rafters required approximately 20% more lumber than a conventional roof, an expense that drew criticism from cost-conscious neighbors. The knee braces added another day of cutting and fitting. The extra shingles needed to cover the larger roof area represented a measurable increase in both materials and labor. But Eli calculated these costs against the alternative: repeated repairs to moisture-damaged sills, doors that swelled and stuck in wet weather, and the endless winter labor of digging access paths through drifts. As September progressed and other cabins neared completion, Eli's methodical approach made him a target for good-natured ribbing that carried an edge of genuine criticism. The tallyman's assessment became the township's unofficial verdict. Eli was overbuilding from inexperience or anxiety, wasting resources that careful settlers preserved for more critical needs. The mushroom roof became a symbol of impractical perfectionism in a place where practical shortcuts often meant survival. The first serious test arrived with an early October storm that dropped 8 inches of wet snow. While other roofs handled the load adequately, the difference in snow distribution became immediately apparent. Conventional cabins developed familiar snow piles against their walls, creating the beginning of what would become chronic moisture problems. Eli's wide eaves threw the same snow load 4 feet away from his cabin walls, leaving the foundation area clear and dry. The storm passed without providing definitive vindication, but observant neighbors began noting the contrast. The real proof would come when winter arrived in full force, and the accumulated effects of dozens of storms revealed which building philosophy understood the true enemy of log construction in snow country. The second blizzard arrived on December 3rd, with the kind of methodical violence that separated surviving homesteaders from those who merely thought they could. For 36 hours, wind drove snow horizontally across the Iron Range at sustained speeds that made standing upright impossible. When the storm finally exhausted itself, it left behind snow depths that reached the windowsills of conventional cabins and temperatures that dropped to around 28 degrees below zero. This wasn't the kind of weather that tested building techniques. It was the kind that revealed which techniques had been built for reality and which had been built for hope. Henrik Koivisto discovered the new mathematics of winter survival when he tried to open his door on the morning of December 5th. The drift against his cabin had solidified into a wall of snow that rose past his shoulders, packed so tightly by the wind that his shovel barely scratched the surface. What should have been a 5-minute task of clearing his threshold became 2 hours of hard labor, chopping and scraping until his arms ached and his breath came in harsh clouds. Even after reaching his door, the frame had swollen from moisture infiltration until the wood bound against itself, requiring shoulder pressure to force it open. The Matala brothers faced similar problems, but with the added complication of a north-facing door that caught the full force of the prevailing winds. Their drift had sculpted itself into a ramp that climbed nearly to their eaves, creating what amounted to a snow roof over their actual roof. Breaking through required digging a tunnel rather than simply clearing a path, and the effort left them exhausted before the day's real work could begin. This was the hidden cost of conventional construction in snow country. Every major storm stole hours of daylight and physical energy that settlers needed for the essential tasks of feeding livestock, maintaining fires, and preventing their cabins from becoming uninhabitable. At the sawmill tallyman's place, the situation had become genuinely dangerous. His tight-eave roof had channeled snow directly against his walls, where successive storms had built a drift system that now reached his windows. The weight of accumulated snow pressed against his foundation logs, with enough force to compress the chinking between them, creating gaps where wind could penetrate and heat could escape. Worse, the base of his cabin had developed the telltale signs of moisture problems, dark stains on the sill logs where meltwater had soaked in during the brief, warm periods between storms. Eli's cabin presented a stark contrast that had become impossible to ignore. While his neighbors battled their way out of snow-buried doorways, he stepped through his threshold onto ground that remained remarkably clear. The wide eaves had performed exactly as designed, throwing each storm's snow load beyond the critical 4-foot perimeter where it could damage the structure. His windows remained unobstructed, allowing precious winter sunlight to penetrate the interior. Most importantly, his foundation logs showed no signs of the moisture infiltration that was already compromising other cabins in the township. The mechanism behind this success became clear to anyone who studied the snow distribution patterns around the various cabins. Conventional roofs created what amounted to moisture traps at their foundations. Snow accumulated against the walls, where daily temperature fluctuations caused partial melting during sunny afternoons, followed by refreezing at night. This cycle created ice formations that sealed moisture against the logs, preventing the wood from drying and creating ideal conditions for rot to begin. The process was slow, but inexorable. Each freeze-thaw cycle drove water deeper into the wood fiber, where it would remain until spring temperatures allowed bacterial decay to begin. Eli's wide overhang had eliminated this destructive cycle by moving the snow deposition zone away from his cabin walls. The 4-foot clear ring around his structure allowed air circulation that kept the foundation logs dry even during the wettest periods. When snow did melt in his yard, the water ran away from the cabin rather than pooling against the foundation. This wasn't just comfort engineering, it was preservation science applied with frontier materials and techniques. The effectiveness of the mushroom roof became measurable in practical terms that resonated with men who thought in terms of hours worked and resources consumed. While neighbors spent 2 to 3 hours after each major storm digging out their doors and clearing access paths, Eli's maintenance routine required only the few minutes needed to sweep his threshold clean. His windows stayed accessible for cleaning and repair, while others struggled to reach theirs through accumulated snow. Most critically, his doors continued to open and close freely, while moisture-swollen frames in other cabins began to stick and bind. By mid-December, the social dynamics in the township had begun to shift. The same neighbors who had mocked Eli's timber waste during construction season now found themselves studying his building techniques with professional interest. Henrik Koivisto made the first direct inquiry, appearing at Eli's door on a clear morning to ask specific questions about rafter extensions and knee brace angles. The sawmill tallyman, whose authority had been built on cost efficiency rather than performance outcomes, found his credibility challenged by the obvious superiority of the wide eave design. The psychological impact of the comparison went beyond simple building techniques. In a community where winter survival depended on conserving energy and maintaining morale, the daily struggle to dig out buried cabins represented a grinding defeat that accumulated over the season. Men who started November with confidence in their building skills found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about frontier construction. The sight of Eli's accessible cabin served as a daily reminder that their own struggles were not inevitable consequences of northern winters, but results of design choices that prioritize speed over effectiveness. As December deepened into the coldest temperatures of the season, the advantages of the mushroom roof extended beyond snow management. The wide eaves provided critical protection for the cabin walls during the freeze-thaw cycles that characterized Iron Range winters. While other cabins developed ice formations where meltwater refroze against their foundations, Eli's protected walls remained dry and stable. The investment in extra lumber and construction time was proving itself through reduced maintenance, easier access, and structural integrity that would extend the cabin's useful life by years or possibly decades. By January of 1905, the true enemy of frontier construction had revealed itself not as cold, but as the relentless cycle of moisture that accompanied every winter storm. The Iron Range settlement was experiencing what old-timers would later remember as a particularly brutal season, one that echoed the legendary hard winter of 1880 to 1881, when rail service to places like De Smet hadn't resumed until early May, leaving entire communities cut off from outside supplies for months. This was the kind of winter that separated structures built for appearance from those engineered for survival. The difference between single storms and seasonal assault became clear as February arrived with its characteristic pattern of freeze, thaw, and refreeze. Each storm deposited its snow load, which then underwent daily cycles of partial melting during brief warming periods, followed by solid refreezing when temperatures dropped. For cabins with conventional tight eaves, this process created ice formations against the walls that acted like slow-acting hammers, driving moisture into every crack and gap in the log construction. The water that penetrated during thaw periods became ice that expanded overnight, forcing chinking from between logs and creating new pathways for wind and moisture to attack the structure. Henrik Koivisto's cabin provided a textbook example of how moisture destroys frontier buildings. By mid-January, his sill logs had developed the characteristic dark staining that indicated water penetration. The chinking between his foundation logs had cracked and fallen out in several places, creating gaps where cold air flowed directly into his living space. His door frame had swollen from absorbed moisture until forcing it open required his full body weight, and closing it again demanded careful timing to catch the brief moments when expansion hadn't completely bound the wood. These weren't cosmetic problems. They were structural failures that threatened the cabin's habitability and his family's survival. The Matilla brothers faced even more serious deterioration. Their north-facing wall, which caught the full force of prevailing winds, had developed ice dams where snow melted during sunny periods and immediately refroze against the logs. These ice formations, some nearly a foot thick, created constant pressure against the chinking and had begun forcing gaps between the logs themselves. Water infiltration during warm periods was followed by ice expansion that widened every crack and fissure in their wall system. The brothers found themselves re-chinking their cabin monthly, a task that should have been an annual maintenance requirement at most. The sawmill tallyman's situation had progressed from inconvenient to genuinely dangerous. The accumulated moisture problems in his foundation had weakened the structural integrity of his cabin's base. Several of his sill logs showed signs of early rot, visible as soft spots that yielded to pressure from a knife blade. The constant wet freeze cycle had created what experienced carpenters knew as the death spiral of log construction. Once moisture penetrated the wood, each subsequent freeze-thaw cycle drove it deeper and opened new channels for water to follow. Without major repairs involving replacement of damaged logs, His cabin would become uninhabitable within another season or two. Eli's cabin presented a stark contrast that had become impossible to dismiss as luck or coincidence. His sill logs remained clean and sound, showing none of the dark staining that indicated moisture penetration. The chinking between his logs stayed intact because ice never formed against his walls with enough pressure to force it loose. His door opened and closed with the same ease as it had in September, because the wood had never absorbed enough moisture to cause swelling and binding. The 4-foot clear zone created by his wide eaves had eliminated the wet freeze cycle that was destroying his neighbors' cabins. The physics of this protection became evident to anyone who observed the different building sites over time. Conventional cabins trapped snow against their walls, where it underwent daily cycles of melting and refreezing that drove water into the wood structure. Each warm period created meltwater that sought every crack and gap in the construction, while each cold snap froze this water in place and used its expansion to force new openings. The cumulative effect resembled what preservation specialists would later identify as the primary cause of log structure failure: moisture infiltration followed by freeze damage that progressively weakened the wood. Eli's wide overhang had broken this destructive cycle by maintaining a dry zone around his cabin walls. Snow that fell from his roof landed 4 feet away from the structure, where wind could scatter it and temperature fluctuations could melt it without creating pooled water against his foundation. When moisture did occur in his yard, it drained away from the cabin rather than soaking into his sill logs. This wasn't theoretical building science, it was practical preservation that could be measured in terms of structural soundness and energy efficiency. The effectiveness of moisture control extended beyond simple structural preservation. Cabins that stayed dry required less firewood because they weren't fighting constant heat loss through gaps and cracks opened by ice damage. Their interiors remained warmer and more comfortable because wind couldn't penetrate through compromised chinking. Most importantly, they maintained their structural integrity season after season instead of requiring constant repairs to address moisture-related damage. As February deepened into the season's most brutal cold snaps, when temperatures dropped to 35 below zero and stayed there for days at a time, the accumulated effects of different building philosophies became undeniable. Neighbors whose cabins had seemed adequate in November now found themselves fighting structural failures that threatened their ability to maintain livable interior conditions. The daily task of forcing swollen doors open and closed became a reminder of building choices that had prioritized speed over durability. Eli's approach to winter construction was revealing itself as something more sophisticated than the overbuilding his neighbors had initially dismissed. His wide eaves represented an understanding of moisture dynamics that went beyond conventional frontier wisdom. While others had focused on quick enclosure to beat the weather, he had built a structure that worked with natural forces rather than simply resisting them. The extra lumber and construction time that had drawn criticism during building season were proving their worth through reduced maintenance requirements and superior performance under the grinding stress of a northern winter. The community's attitude toward the mushroom roof had shifted from mockery to grudging respect, then to active interest as the season's severity made structural performance a matter of survival rather than aesthetics. Men who had criticized Eli's methods now found themselves calculating the cost of replacing rotted sill logs against the expense of building wider eaves from the beginning. The shift in community opinion became official on the morning of March 8th, when Henrik Koivisto appeared at Eli's door carrying a notebook and a measuring tape. The same man who had questioned the wisdom of extended rafters 6 months earlier now wanted precise dimensions for every component of the mushroom roof system. Standing under the wide eaves that had protected Eli's cabin through the worst winter in recent memory, Koivisto methodically recorded measurements while asking detailed questions about rafter spacing, knee brace angles, and foundation clearances. 48 inches from wall to drip line, Koivisto noted, as he stretched his tape measure from the cabin wall to the point where melted snow fell from the eaves. And you set your sill logs how high above grade? 10 inches on stone piers, Eli replied, gesturing to the carefully positioned field stone supports that kept his foundation logs clear of ground moisture. Water can't climb what it can't reach. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering every aspect of wide eave construction from initial timber selection to final roofing details. Koivisto filled several pages with sketches and measurements, transforming Eli's empirical building knowledge into a set of plans that could be replicated by other settlers. This represented more than simple curiosity. It was the beginning of a fundamental change in how the Iron Range community approached winter construction. The Matilla brothers arrived later that same week, drawn by reports that Eli was sharing his building techniques with interested neighbors. Their own cabin had suffered so much structural damage that major repairs would be required before the following winter, and they wanted to incorporate wide eave principles into their reconstruction work. They spent an entire afternoon studying the knee brace system that supported Eli's extended rafters, measuring angles and asking questions about load distribution and connection methods. The sawmill tallyman's arrival marked the most significant acknowledgement of the mushroom roof's vindication. The same man who had publicly criticized Eli's timber waste now appeared with his own measuring tools and a professional interest in wide eave construction techniques. His change of position reflected more than personal embarrassment. It represented a practical recognition that structural performance mattered more than material economy when building in snow country. "I'll need to adjust my lumber orders if more folks want to build like this," the tallyman admitted as he examined the rafter tail extensions. "Those long timbers cost more to mill, but I reckon they're cheaper than replacing rotten sills every few years." The technical details that neighbors recorded during their visits to Eli's cabin became the foundation for what would later emerge as regional building standards adapted to northern Minnesota conditions. The 48-inch overhang measurement was repeatedly confirmed and copied. The 12/12 roof pitch became recognized as the minimum slope for reliable snow shedding. The diagonal knee brace system was sketched and studied until settlers understood both the structural principles and the practical construction techniques required to replicate them. By late March, 3 new cabins were under construction using variations of Eli's wide eave design. Young families who had arrived too late in 1904 to complete their buildings before winter were now incorporating extended overhangs into their spring construction plans. The mushroom roof had evolved from neighborhood curiosity to accepted practice within a single brutal season, proof that frontier communities could adapt quickly when survival depended on learning from demonstrated success. The adoption of wide eave construction represented more than simple imitation. It reflected a deeper understanding of the relationship between building techniques and environmental conditions. Settlers who had initially focused on speed and material economy now recognized that structural durability required different priorities in snow country. The extra lumber and a construction time that Eli had invested were being reframed as insurance against the kind of moisture damage that had plagued conventional cabins throughout the winter. The preserved farmstead that Eli would eventually complete demonstrated the long-term effectiveness of his building philosophy. By the time he finished his work in the following decades, the site contained 16 different structures, each incorporating the moisture control principles that had proved themselves during that first brutal winter. The wide eaves that had drawn mockery became a signature feature of Iron Range finish construction, passed down through generations of builders who understood that water was the primary enemy of log structures in northern climates. The transformation of community opinion was complete when spring arrived and settlers began assessing the winter damage to their cabins. Those with conventional tight eaves faced extensive repair work, replacing rotted sill logs, rechinking compromised walls, and rebuilding door frames that had been destroyed by moisture infiltration. The costs in materials, labor, and lost time far exceeded the additional investment that wide eaves would have required during initial construction. Eli's cabin needed no major repairs. His sill logs remained sound, his chinking intact, his doors functional. The dry perimeter created by his mushroom roof had protected the structure so effectively that spring maintenance involved only routine tasks, checking the roof for winter damage and clearing debris from around the foundation. This wasn't just superior performance. It was a demonstration of building science that would influence Iron Range construction practices for generations. The final storm of the season arrived in early April, bringing with it a test that sealed the reputation of the wide eave design. While neighbors once again struggled to dig their way out of snow-buried doorways, Eli stepped through his threshold onto clear ground for what had become a familiar ritual. The snow line began exactly where his roof dictated it should begin, 4 feet from his cabin walls, maintaining the dry zone that had protected his structure through months of the kind of weather that destroyed conventional buildings. In the years that followed, the mushroom roof became part of the regional vocabulary of survival construction. Settlers arriving in Iron Range townships learned the technique from neighbors who had witnessed its effectiveness firsthand. The wide eaves that had once symbolized wasteful overbuilding were now recognized as essential engineering for anyone serious about long-term structural integrity in snow country. Eli's investment in extra lumber and construction time had proved itself through a winter that revealed the true cost of building inadequately for northern conditions.